believe in forgiving or forgetting?
I'm taking you out of the will, my mother said with a little laugh under her breath, the kind of laugh that's not quite loud enough to be noticed by the people at the next table, but sharp enough to slice straight through my spine like a razor made of ice. She said it while reaching for her glass of iced tea with the same careless elegance she reserved for sending waiters back to the kitchen or correcting people's pronunciation of her name. Linda. Never Mom. At least not when she was pissed, and she was always a little pissed when she was talking to me. We were at her favorite brunch spot, that place she insisted on going to every time she wanted to perform some little theater piece in public, a place with white linen tablecloths, waiters who didn't speak unless spoken to, and those ridiculous tiny silver spoons for stirring cream into coffee. She'd made the reservation under Dr. Linda Harrison. Even though she'd never practiced a day of medicine, the PhD in psychology was just another crown she liked to wear to feel taller than everyone around her. Across from me sat my younger brother Matt, lounging like he owned the damn place. Shirt open one button too far, aviators still on despite being indoors, one arm lazily draped across the back of his chair like he was about to light a cigarette and deliver a monologue about how misunderstood he was. He smirked at Mom's little announcement like she'd just pulled off some slick punchline. I half expected applause from him. I didn't say anything for a beat. I looked at her, really looked, taking in the calculated tilt of her chin, the way her fingers toyed with the edge of her napkin like she was barely suppressing delight. This wasn't news. It was a power move. A show. And she thought I'd cry or get angry or maybe beg because that's what she lived for. The reaction. The control. The validation that, even after all this time, she still had her hooks in me. But instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. Thick, cream-colored, heavy paper with my name handwritten in clean black ink. I slid it across the table, careful and calm, like I was handing over a thank you card. She looked at it like I'd just dropped a scorpion in her lap. Funny timing, I said, sipping my coffee without breaking eye contact. This came from my lawyer yesterday. Her smirk twitched. Not much, just the slightest hitch in her mask, but it was enough. Her fingers hovered over the envelope for a second, uncertain, before she picked it up and began to open it. I wish I could say I felt triumphant in that moment, like some avenging angel finally bringing justice down on the woman who made my life a series of auditions I could never pass. But the truth is, I felt nothing. Just a kind of numb detachment that had become familiar over the years, the same feeling I got whenever she used her sweet voice to cut me down in front of family friends, or when she told me I'd never really recovered from the divorce because I refused to come crawling back home. I watched as she pulled out the document, her eyes scanning the page. Her lips tightened. Her fingers stiffened. And for the first time in my entire life, I saw something new on her face, fear. Now, before we go any further, let me ask you something. What would you do if the woman who raised you like a project instead of a person suddenly told you that you were cut out of the legacy she always held over your head, not because of anything you'd done, but because, for once, you didn't play along? Would you crumble? Or would you smile and hand her a letter that could burn the entire house down? The silence at the table stretched. Matt finally took off his sunglasses, his forehead wrinkled in confusion. "What's that?" he asked, his voice too casual, like he already didn't like where this was going. Linda didn't answer. She read the second page. Then the third. Her skin went pale in a way no amount of Botox or tinted moisturizer could fix. I watched the color drain from her cheeks like someone had flipped a switch, and her whole posture changed from arrogant and amused to tight and brittle, like she was shrinking into herself. She looked at me, not with the usual contempt or smugness, but with something much closer to panic. I didn't blink. "That's not possible," she whispered. This isn't possible." "Oh, it's very possible," I said, my voice calm, steady, even pleasant. Rick made sure of that. The name hit her like a slap. She actually recoiled slightly, clutching the papers like they were radioactive. Matt leaned forward, trying to read over her shoulder, but she slapped the pages against the table and shoved them back into the envelope like they were something obscene. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said sharply, her voice dropping to a hiss that only I could hear. You're making a mistake. A big one. I shrugged, folding my hands in my lap. If you say so. There was a silence then, thick and awkward, broken only by the clinking of silverware from the nearby tables and the distant sound of laughter from a bridal shower group near the window. Matt looked between us like a kid who just realized he'd walked into the middle of a fire he helped start. Linda stood up abruptly, knocking her chair back. She clutched her handbag with stiff fingers and glared down at me like I was the villain in some drama she hadn't agreed to be in. "This isn't over," she said. I looked up at her, calm as ever. "It kind of is," I said. "You just don't know it yet." She stormed off, heels clicking on tile, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and the echo of a woman losing her grip. Matt stayed seated for a second, looking stunned. Then he asked, "What the hell was that?" I finished my coffee, laid a 20 on the table, and stood up. That, I said, turning to leave, was the first crack. Because what Mom didn't know yet, what Matt would figure out far too late, was that the will she waved around like a weapon wasn't the only one that mattered. Uncle Rick, the black sheep everyone underestimated, had his own game. And I was holding the winning hand. But that was just the beginning. Growing up in our house felt less like being raised by a mother and more like surviving a hostile takeover, the kind where every ounce of affection had a price tag and every act of rebellion was treated like a personal betrayal of the family brand. Linda didn't mother, she managed. She orchestrated. She curated a life that looked pristine from the outside, all shining surfaces and perfect smiles, but inside it was cold, hollow, and so tightly wound that you learned to keep your mouth shut before you learned to tie your shoes. And the strangest part is, none of it felt strange at the time. It just was. The air in the house wasn't breathable unless you'd earned it. Matt, of course, never had to earn a damn thing. From the moment he was born, she treated him like a little prince whose only job in life was to shine, and if he dulled, even for a moment, she'd polish him right back up, no matter the cost to herself or to anyone else. I used to think it was because he was the baby, the boy, the soft spot in a heart otherwise made of steel. But the older I got, the more I realized it wasn't love that made her spoil him. It was vanity. He was her reflection, her chosen one, the golden child who got to live the life she always thought she deserved. By the time he was 16, Matt was already playing with fire. He was drinking, disappearing for weekends at a time, flunking out of classes, and always finding new ways to set money on fire, and every time he came home reeking of trouble, she forgave him before he even asked. There were no real consequences, just more second chances wrapped in soft words and tighter hugs. Meanwhile, I was over in the corner, holding down 2 part-time jobs, taking care of the house, getting good grades, and learning the hard way that nothing I did would ever be enough. It wasn't that she hated me, she just didn't need me the way she needed him. The first real fracture between us came on the day I told her I was moving out after college. I'd gotten a decent job offer in another city, a little 1-bedroom apartment near downtown, and for the first time in my life, I felt something close to freedom until I told her. Her face went blank, then cold, like I'd just confessed to a crime. She said, "So you're abandoning your family?" "After everything I've done." I still remember the way she said I, not we. Dad had checked out years earlier, floating somewhere between resentment and resignation. He died when I was 27, not suddenly, but slowly, worn down by years of trying to be the invisible glue between 2 people who didn't speak unless they were sharpening knives. I didn't hear much from Matt over the years unless he needed something: money, a place to crash, an alibi. And Mom? She stayed in touch just enough to keep the illusion alive. Birthday calls that lasted 2 minutes. Christmas gifts mailed a week late. The occasional email with a subject line like, "Interesting article," but no actual message inside. She'd trained herself to appear involved just enough to avoid blame, but distant enough that I couldn't accuse her of caring. And in a way, that was worse than open cruelty. At least rage is honest. Her indifference was a kind of slow poison. When Uncle Rick died, I hadn't seen him in almost 8 years, but I still felt something twist in my chest when I got the call. He was the only one in that family who treated me like a human being, not a daughter. Not a disappointment. Just a person. He used to take me out for ice cream when I was little, not because it was his duty, but because he liked spending time with me. He told bad jokes, smoked too much, and always had a stack of old Rolling Stones in his den that he swore were worth a fortune. He never married, never had kids, and according to my mother, never really figured it out. But I think he figured out more than she ever did. The funeral was small, mostly people I didn't recognize, plus a few grizzled old friends from his bar days who looked like they'd seen the end of the world and decided to keep drinking anyway. Mom wore black like it was armor, sunglasses that didn't come off even inside the church, and Matt showed up hungover, eyes glassy and hands twitching. I stayed quiet, listening, watching, and trying to piece together what Rick had been doing in the last few years. Something felt off, like there was a missing piece no one was talking about. After the service, an older man in a brown blazer and faded jeans approached me just outside the church doors. He introduced himself as Daniel Hirsch, Rick's attorney, and said there was something Rick wanted me to have privately. I asked what it was. He just handed me a thick envelope, sealed and initialed, with my name on the front in Rick's handwriting. It sat on my desk for a week before I opened it. Inside was a letter and a copy of a separate will, dated 6 months before his death. The contents weren't just surprising, they were nuclear. In the letter, Rick wrote that he'd seen what Linda had done to me over the years, and while he'd kept his distance to avoid war within the family, he never forgot what I went through, and he never forgave her for what she allowed Matt to become. He wrote that he didn't have millions, but what he did have, the house, the retirement fund, a few investments, would go to me, and only me. Not because I needed it, but because I'd earned it. The catch? There was a condition. A final request. I had to wait. I had to let Linda make her move first. Only once she tried to cut me out of her will, only when she chose to discard me, could Rick's instructions be acted upon. He predicted it. Word for word. He knew her. So when she sat across from me at that brunch table, looking me dead in the eye and saying she was cutting me out, I didn't feel rage or heartbreak. I felt the gears click into place. Because that letter in my purse, the one that made her pale and silent, was the trigger Rick had left behind. And I was finally ready to pull it. The law office was nothing like what I expected, though I'm not sure what I had been expecting. Maybe something polished and sleek, glass walls and sterile lighting, with young associates rushing past in expensive suits like a television drama come to life. But instead, I found myself standing in front of a one-story brick building nestled between a closed-down diner and a faded tax service that hadn't updated its sign since the early 90s. The parking lot was gravel, not paved, and the only car out front was a rusted-out Buick that looked like it hadn't moved since the Bush administration. For a moment, I wondered if I had the wrong address or if this was some kind of mistake, but when I stepped inside and smelled the old paper, lemon polish, and the unmistakable undertone of cigar smoke soaked into the wood, I realized I was exactly where I needed to be. Daniel Hirsch sat behind a cluttered oak desk that looked like it had been dragged out of a courtroom in the 70s and never dusted again. He was in his 70s himself, with a face like creased leather and a voice that sounded like gravel in a coffee can. When he saw me, he didn't stand up or offer a handshake. He just gestured to the chair across from him with a nod and said, "You're late." But then again, Rick always said you were cautious. I didn't bother apologizing. I sat down, crossed my legs, and waited. He reached into a drawer, pulled out a thick manila folder, and laid it in front of him with both hands like it was something sacred. "You ready for this?" he asked. "Does it matter?" I said, and he actually gave a short laugh, like he'd been waiting for that answer. Inside the folder was a copy of Rick's final will, not the sanitized version Mom had managed to get her hands on and parade around like it was gospel, but a more recent, far more detailed document that had never passed through her orbit. This one had specific instructions, contingencies, and a level of pettiness so sharp it almost cut through the page. Rick hadn't just left everything to me: the house, the cash, the stocks in that obscure little trucking company he'd invested in decades ago that had somehow turned into a gold mine. He had done so with a message. This was not a gift out of affection. This was a correction. I remember sitting there, scanning the paragraphs, my eyes snagging on phrases like, "in the event that my sister Linda attempts to exert influence over my estate," and "contingent upon the disinheritance of my niece Sarah by her mother." It was all so specific, so planned, like Rick had anticipated Linda's every move, predicted her manipulations, and woven a legal noose she'd never see coming until it was already around her neck. But even beyond the financial revenge, what really stopped me cold was the final clause, the one that came after the bequests and conditions, tucked at the end like an afterthought, but carrying the weight of a bomb. There had been an investigation. Not formal, not with police or courts, but personal, quiet, and deliberate. Rick had hired a private investigator years ago, someone thorough and discreet, to look into some things he'd always suspected but never had the proof for. And the results, he'd said, had confirmed what the rest of us were too cowardly to say aloud. The report, which Daniel handed to me in a separate envelope, unsealed but unopened, contained a single, typed page. It detailed financial transactions between Linda and a man named Gregory Fallon, made in monthly installments over a span of almost 6 years. The payments began 2 months after my father's funeral. Gregory Fallon was a name I didn't recognize until I kept reading and saw the note beneath his name, birth father of Matthew Harrison. I stared at that line for a long time, longer than I think Daniel was comfortable with, because after a few minutes he leaned forward and said, "Your uncle wanted you to know what you were dealing with. He didn't want you walking blind into a war you didn't start." I didn't speak. I didn't ask questions. I just folded the paper, tucked it back into the envelope, and put it in my bag. This wasn't just about money anymore. It never had been. The next day, I met with my own attorney, a woman named Elise who didn't blink when I showed her the documents. She was clean-cut, sharp-eyed, and looked like she could tear Linda to pieces with a well-placed comma. We spent hours drafting the formal letter, the one I would later hand to Linda at brunch, and attaching the necessary documents to ensure she understood that this wasn't a threat. It was a conclusion. One she had walked directly into. Rick had structured everything in such a way that if Linda attempted to challenge the will, she would be opening herself up to legal exposure, not just in terms of probate law, but in terms of fraud, concealed paternity, and years of financial misrepresentation involving Matt's supposed inheritance. Everything had been drawn up with clinical precision, every loophole closed, every angle covered. And if she tried to make it public, that report would become very, very visible. The thing is, I didn't want the house. I didn't want the money either. But I took them because Rick had trusted me with them, and because for the first time in my life, someone in that family had looked at me and said, "I see you. I see what they did to you. And I believe you deserve better." That kind of gift isn't something you turn down. So when I walked out of Daniel Hirsch's office, with the will in one hand and the report in the other, I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. I felt ready. Not for a fight, because this wasn't going to be a fight. It was going to be a reckoning. One she never saw coming. Linda had always believed she was untouchable, that she could spin any story, charm any lawyer, guilt any child into silence. She thought the past was something she'd buried and forgotten, not realizing that some people, like Rick, make damn good gravediggers. And as for Matt? Well, he had no idea the foundation under his feet was about to collapse. But I wasn't going to tell him. Not yet. The strange thing about revenge, real revenge, not the kind you fantasize about in the shower or vent about over drinks with old friends, is that it doesn't feel nearly as satisfying as you think it will when you're finally standing at the edge of it, watching everything fall exactly the way you planned. There's no applause, no soundtrack, no dramatic gasp from the heavens. It's quiet, heavy, surgical. And if you've done it right, the person on the receiving end won't even realize how badly they've been cut until the bleeding starts. That's what made the brunch with Linda so deliciously unbearable. Because as I sat there, watching her lips wrap around that god-awful sentence, "I'm taking you out of the will," I already knew she'd stepped into the trap. And not just stepped into it, she'd jumped, blindfolded, heels first, with a smile on her face, thinking she was the one pulling strings. That letter, the one I handed her like it was a damn birthday card, was more than just legal language and dry threats. It was a loaded gun wrapped in velvet, dressed up in lawyer speak and notarized betrayal. It contained a formal notification from my attorney, Elise, outlining the full activation of Uncle Rick's will, as well as a binding document transferring all of Rick's assets to me and freezing any access Linda or Matt might have assumed they had. Attached to that was an affidavit signed by Daniel Hirsch and 2 other witnesses, verifying the legitimacy of Rick's instructions and acknowledging the existence of the sealed paternity report that implicated Linda in over 2 decades of deception. Linda's hands had trembled when she read it, not dramatically, not like in the movies, but subtly, like the motor functions in her body were trying to figure out whether to scream or collapse. I watched her eyes race across the page, that telltale flicker of comprehension settling in as the words finally pierced through her ego. And when she looked up at me for just a second, she didn't see her daughter. She saw her reckoning. But even then, even when faced with irrefutable proof that her web of control had finally snapped, she tried to collect herself with that same withered dignity she'd always clung to, straightening her shoulders, pressing her lips into a line, and pretending like the paper in her hands didn't contain the blueprint to her own undoing. "This is fraudulent," she said, her voice cracking ever so slightly, a half note of panic curling beneath the surface, like a loose thread on a very expensive coat. "It won't hold up." I leaned forward just slightly, enough to invade her space, and said it already did. She blinked. Matt, clueless and suddenly uncomfortable, shifted in his seat, staring between us like a kid at a family dinner who just realized the adults are about to start yelling. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, his voice rising just a notch. "Mom?" Linda didn't answer him. She couldn't. Her mouth opened, then closed, like she was trying to piece together a story quickly enough to throw over the truth like a blanket, but the thing about truth is once it's out, you can't dress it up. It just sits there, naked and ugly, and everyone can see it for what it is. So I took mercy on her. Or maybe I just wanted to twist the knife a little slower. "Why don't you tell him, Mom?" I said, calmly, the way you might ask someone to pass the salt. "Tell him about the money. The payments. The man you kept off the family tree." Her face drained of what little color it had left. I knew that shade of white, not rage, not fear, but shame. The real kind. The kind that feels like acid under the skin. Matt looked at her, eyebrows furrowing, and I could see it click in real time, that dawning, stomach-sickening realization that something in his foundation was cracking. "What payments?" he asked, but it came out too soft, too slow, like he already knew the answer but needed her to say it to make it real. Linda stared at me like she could will me into silence, but that ship had sailed. The letter was the trigger. The gun was already fired. All that was left was the fallout. "I think he deserves to know," I said. "You owe him that much." Still, nothing from her. Just silence. The kind that's louder than screaming. So I stood up, calmly, and placed the folder on the table between us. "You should read it, Matt. Every page. Especially the last one." He didn't move, didn't even reach for it. He just stared at her like a stranger, his fingers twitching slightly near the edge of his plate, as if unsure whether to grab the folder or flip the entire table. And, just like that, the air shifted. Whatever illusion of control Linda thought she had shattered right there in that overpriced brunch spot, beneath chandeliers that suddenly felt too bright and chairs that no longer seemed stable. People at nearby tables were starting to glance over, sensing the tension but too polite to stare openly. And still, she sat there, hands frozen, lips tight, every line on her face deepening under the weight of years she couldn't undo. "I didn't want it to end like this," I said, and I meant it. "But you made that decision a long time ago." Linda stood suddenly, knocking her chair back, clutching her bag like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She opened her mouth to deny it, to lie, to lash out, "I'll never know," but nothing came. Just a dry rasp. And then, without a word, she turned and walked out of the restaurant. Matt didn't follow. He just sat there, staring down at the folder, the color slowly draining from his face as he began to understand the shape of the truth he'd been living under all his life. And I left him there. Because there was nothing else to say. Nothing else to prove. The game had ended the moment Linda opened that letter. She just hadn't realized she'd already lost. When I woke up the morning after that brunch, if you could call it brunch, more like an execution in disguise, I expected to feel something closer to relief, maybe even a kind of satisfaction that, after decades of being the background noise in my own family, I had finally grabbed the volume dial and silenced everyone else, at least for a moment. But instead, as I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring into a mug of coffee I didn't remember making, the feeling that clung to me wasn't victory or pride, and it certainly wasn't peace. It was something heavier, something far more familiar, a dull ache in my chest that reminded me that no matter how clean the cuts had been, what I had done still came at a price. And whether or not I was ready to pay it, the transaction had already been processed. Linda didn't call that night. Neither did Matt. There were no emails, no voicemails, no passive-aggressive texts or dramatic attempts at damage control, and in a strange way, the silence was more unnerving than any confrontation could have been. I expected fury, maybe legal threats or a barrage of tear-stained messages demanding I explain myself or begging for forgiveness, but instead I got nothing. Just the sound of absence, humming in my ears like a warning. That's how I knew she was planning something. Because Linda never stayed quiet unless she was already halfway through her next move. It came 2 days later, in the form of a woman named Diane, a name I hadn't heard in over 5 years and a face I hadn't seen in even longer. Not since she and Linda used to co-host those ridiculous charity luncheons where they'd sip overpriced wine and gossip about everyone in the room with the kind of poisonous grace only women like them could perfect. Diane had been Linda's best friend for most of my life, her closest confidant, and, as it turned out, the executor of Linda's personal will. I opened the door that morning to find her standing on my porch, heels perfectly polished, gray-streaked hair pulled into a severe twist, and a folder clutched in her manicured hand like it was something sacred. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice smooth but brittle around the edges. I almost said no, almost closed the door in her face just to prove that the rules had changed, but something in her expression stopped me, not sympathy, not warmth, but a quiet seriousness that didn't match the smug, polished woman I remembered. So I stepped aside and she entered, walking into my living room like it was a courtroom, setting the folder on my coffee table as if it weighed more than it looked. "This isn't from Linda," she said, settling onto the edge of my couch. "This is from Rick." At first, I thought she was lying, maybe trying to bluff her way into reversing what had already been set in motion, but when I opened the folder and saw the signature, Rick's unmistakable handwriting, scrawled in thick black ink, I knew she was telling the truth. It was another will. Not a revision of the one I already had, but a completely separate document, signed and dated 2 years before the one Daniel had given me, and buried so deeply that even Linda hadn't known it existed. It had been filed under Diane's protection, hidden from the rest of the family, to be revealed only under one condition, that I followed through. "I don't understand," I said, flipping through the pages, my heart pounding harder with every paragraph I read. "Why didn't you give this to Hirsch?" Diane took a breath, clasping her hands in her lap. "Because Rick didn't trust anyone completely. Not even Daniel. He made me swear that I wouldn't show you this unless you passed his final test, not just to expose Linda, but to walk away from her, no matter what she did next." "What test?" I asked, although I already knew. "He wanted to know if you could let go," she said, her voice lower now. "Not just of her money, or her power, or the life you could have had if she'd been different. He wanted to know if you could walk away without trying to change her, because that's what she does, Sarah. She makes people believe they can fix her, or win her, or beat her at her own game. But she only survives if you stay on the board." I sat there, absorbing that, feeling something twist inside me, not guilt exactly, but the cold, sick understanding that Rick had seen through all of us more clearly than we'd ever seen ourselves. The rest of the document laid out his final instructions. Not only was the estate mine, every penny, every asset, every acre of land he had tucked away in trust accounts I hadn't even known about, but there was one last piece, the most personal and the most devastating. Rick had left behind a letter. Not typed. Handwritten. 3 pages. The first two were about me, about the little girl I'd been, the woman I'd become, and the things he regretted not saying while he was still alive. He talked about how he'd watched me fight to build a life out of the scraps I'd been handed, how he'd seen the way Linda tried to bend me into something smaller than I was, and how proud he'd been when I refused to break, even when it would have been easier. But the third page wasn't about me. It was about Matt. He wrote that he had always suspected the truth about Matt's paternity, not because of anything dramatic, but because of the way Linda had changed after Dad's death. Quietly panicked. Cautious in a way she never was before. Rick had asked questions, hired investigators, pulled threads until the whole thing unraveled. And then he sat with the knowledge, heavy and hot and ugly, for years. Not because he wanted to protect her, but because he wanted to protect me. He said he knew that exposing it too early would only hurt me, only drag me deeper into the orbit of a woman who had already taken too much. But he left me with a choice. The folder contained everything I would need to take Linda down publicly: the report, the banking records, the letters between her and Matt's biological father, even a recorded voicemail she'd left for Rick in which she admitted it, begging him not to tell anyone. And the will, this new one, gave me the power to make all of it disappear. "I leave this choice to you, Sarah," he wrote. "Destroy her or walk away and take back your life. But either way, do it knowing I believed you were always worth more than she let you believe." I sat with that folder for hours after Diane left, the documents spread out like puzzle pieces I wasn't sure I wanted to assemble. I thought about Matt, about the way he'd looked at me across that brunch table, lost and furious and betrayed. I thought about the way Linda's voice had cracked when she realized she was no longer the queen of the game. And then I thought about something Rick had once told me when I was a teenager and crying over some argument I don't even remember anymore. Not every fight is worth the scar. In the end, I burned the evidence. Not out of mercy, not out of weakness, but because, for the first time in my life, I didn't need revenge to feel whole. Linda had already lost the one thing she valued most: control. And I finally walked away. But I'll say this much, and I say it with every ounce of the cold, clear truth that Rick left me with. When I look at Matt now, I don't feel pity, or hate, or even love. I just feel sorry for the man who never knew which name he carried. And for the mother who built an entire legacy on lies. Because she may still be breathing, but she's already gone.